Well, it is so good to see all of you here tonight. There are a number of visitors I know that are with us, and it's a great encouragement to me to see a number of faces that I've seen on more than one occasion this week. We're very glad for your attendance tonight. We hope that our study will be that which is beneficial to us. Change. Change is something that, for many people, can be very, very difficult. I'm one of those people. I don't like change. I'm not just talking about big change. I'm talking about any change. I'm one of those people that when I go to a restaurant to eat, I always order the same thing. I try on a daily basis to maintain a consistent routine. Whenever possible, I do the same thing at the same time, day after day, week after week, year after year. It's just the kind of person I am. Kind of pitiful, isn't it? I'm just one of those people for whom change doesn't come easily. You may be that kind of person. I don't know. I hope maybe you're not quite to that extreme. But if you're not, it's very likely that you know someone who is. For the kind of person that I'm talking about, even small changes in character or lifestyle can prove to be very difficult. When you start talking about a total lifestyle transformation, that's something that can bring about more than just a slight discomfort. Maybe you know someone that has attempted some kind of a dramatic transformation in their life. For instance, it could be the change from an unhealthy lifestyle to a more healthy type lifestyle, a more healthy style of living. Diet, exercise, things of that nature. It's a big change. It could be that one might determine to change from a lifestyle of financial insecurity to a lifestyle of more strict financial planning. Developing a budget, living on a budget, and things of that nature. It could be a change from a lifestyle of disorganized clutter to a more organized way of life. On one occasion, a doctor told his patient, he said, "You're in terrible shape." He said, "You've got to do something to stop this." He said, "First, you need to tell your wife to cook more nutritious meals. Stop working like a dog. Tell your wife that you've got to develop a budget and that she's got to stick with it. Tell her to keep the kids off your back so that you've got some time to relax. Unless you make those kind of changes in your life, you'll be dead in a month." Well, the man said, "Doctor, this has sounded a lot more official coming from you. Could you call my wife and tell her what you said?" Well, the fellow got home, and his wife rushed to him, and she wailed. She said, "You poor man, the doctor said you've only got 30 days to live." Change. It's difficult. And whenever a person makes that kind of radical change in their life, there's always going to be growing pains, because that kind of change just doesn't come easily. But perhaps there is no more difficult process in life than the change from a life that is lived for self to a life that is devoted to a higher cause. The most important change that we can make in life is when we determine to live a life that is totally dedicated to Christ. That may be the most difficult change to make. In fact, there are many decent, moral, good people who reject the thought of Christianity because they believe they could never be good enough, and thus their transformation would never be complete. I want to introduce you to someone tonight. You've probably been introduced to this individual before. who made as complete a transformation as anyone could ever make. He was on a journey to Damascus when the great apostle Paul was still known as Saul, that he began the ultimate transformation. And that was a process that he would continue for the remainder of his life. The encounter that Saul had with Jesus on the road that led to a city called Damascus would turn his world upside down. But it would turn his life right side up. As we begin our study tonight, I want for us to talk a little bit about and come to a better understanding of the origin of Saul's defiance. Saul was from the coastal city of Tarsus, near the northeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea. Now that's significant for this reason. Tarsus was made the capital of the Roman province of Cilicia in 67 BC. And therefore Saul came into this world with something of a dual identity. He was a Jew by nationality, but a Roman citizen also, and this unique combination would allow him ultimately to travel and speak for God in places and in languages that few people would have been able to do at that time. Furthermore, he belonged to the tribe of Benjamin. Philippians 3 and verse 5. What do we know about the tribe of Benjamin? This was a tribe that was well known for its fierce and zealous devotion. It could be the case that Saul's parents perhaps might have named him for the first king of Israel, who was also a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin. 1 Samuel 9 and verses 1 and 2. Once Saul completed his studies in Tarsus, he was accepted into the school that was taught by the Pharisee scholars in Jerusalem. And it was there that he would study under the famous teacher Gamaliel. Acts 22 and verse 3. Saul was deeply passionate about his religion. He was totally committed to becoming a devoted Pharisee. In fact, notice what he said about himself in Philippians chapter 3, beginning in verse 4. He said, "Though I might also have confidence in the flesh, if any other man thinketh that he hath whereof he might trust in the flesh, I more, circumcised the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, an Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law, a Pharisee, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is in the law, blameless." Here is a zealous man. Here is a man that is totally dedicated to the religion under which he was trained. You know, it's been said that love is blind. Well, Saul's love for his religion led him to be totally convinced of the inerrancy of the Pharisaical doctrine and of his own righteousness. He was convinced of that, and he was blinded to everything else. That was Saul. But a problem arose. You see, around the time when Saul would have arrived in Jerusalem to begin his schooling under the Pharisaical law, this new movement began. It came to be known as Christianity. After the apostles baptized those 3,000 plus believers on the day of Pentecost, the Christian movement began to spread very, very rapidly. And over the course of the next 4 years or so, various disciples of Jesus were publicly humiliated. They were persecuted for promoting what was considered at that time an inflammatory religion that was highly critical of the Jewish leaders and the teachings of Judaism. In other words, it contradicted everything that Saul held so dear. And as is so often the case, the more the Jewish leaders persecuted the disciples of Jesus, the more popular they became. That's the world that Saul knew as a young man. The explosive growth of Christianity in and around Jerusalem became a focal point for increasing frustration among the Sanhedrin, Israel's highest court, and that was the world that he knew. Now I want you to move forward with me to Acts chapter 8. Acts chapter 8, and I want you to notice with me as we begin to see Saul's defiance. In Acts chapter 8, a disciple named Stephen is called before the Sanhedrin. He's accused of blasphemy against Moses and against God. Stephen is anxious to present Jesus to those leaders of Israel, and ultimately Stephen, of course, would become the first recorded martyr for the Christian religion. But Saul was there. He was an observer in the courtroom when Stephen was being tried. No doubt Saul was gratified when he saw Stephen put to death, because he agreed that all Christians should be destroyed, or they would instead destroy Judaism. And that's the religion that he had devoted his life to. So as members of the Sanhedrin began to shed their cloaks and pick up those stones to begin to stone Stephen, young Saul sees an opportunity. He wants to be of service. He volunteers to hold the coats and the garments of those executioners. And I'm sure that he relished in excitement at the killing of this Christian dissident. There was no doubt in Saul's mind that the Sanhedrin was fulfilling the law of God, the will of God. So Saul seized the moment and used the destruction of Christianity as a way to seek his own advancement in the Pharisaical party. So he volunteers to go and seek out Christians and bring them before the Sanhedrin. And we read in Acts chapter 8 and verse 3, as for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house, hailing men and women, committing them to prison. Now, as you might expect, the name Saul of Tarsus quickly became infamous among Christians. Saul was fresh out of graduate school. He was bright. He was on the fast track as far as his career in the Pharisee party was concerned. He was devoted to legalism. He was always intent on observing the letter of the law. He was motivated. The suffering that he inflicted upon these Christians, it didn't bother him. He was willing to do whatever it took to save Judaism. And his tireless actions made him perfect for the job. But the more Saul chased the Christians throughout Jerusalem, the more the gospel spread as they fled for their lives. Right? Acts 8 and verse 4, therefore they that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the word. Eventually, Saul heard that there were a significant number of Christians that had caused the same kind of problems in Damascus that they'd been causing in Jerusalem. And so we read in Acts 9, beginning in verse 1, that Saul, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and desired of him letters to Damascus to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, whether they were men or women, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem. Now, Damascus was a city located in a remote area some 150 miles north of Jerusalem. It had the potential to become a very important city in the spread of Christianity. Because of its isolated existence, it was a city where many travelers would stop as they were going to various points within the known world at that time. And that gave the Christians that lived there the opportunity to spread the gospel to new faces just about every day. Now, as Saul was traveling toward Damascus with the intent of persecuting more Christians, all of a sudden something happens. A bright light shines down from heaven, and Saul falls to the ground. And he hears a voice cry out from heaven that says, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Now Saul immediately wants to know, I think, what any of us would want to know in a situation like this. His question is, who art thou, Lord? So the Lord responds, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks or the goads. Jesus here shows his omnipotence, his omniscience. A goad was a stick or a rod that was used to prod animals as they were being guided along the way. And Jesus here suggests that he knows that Saul is now struggling within himself. Saul was no longer sure of what he had previously been the surest of in the world, that he was living a life that was in accordance with the will of God. And it was then that Saul asks the most important question of his life. It's a question that he would ask over and over again for the duration of his ministry. Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And the Lord told him, Arise, go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do. Now something has changed within Saul. We've noticed Saul's defiance, but now consider that Saul is defeated. Instead of the bright, self-directing, self-important, self-assured young Pharisee with this bright future ahead, Saul is now blind and totally confused. He was traveling to Damascus to take Christians captive, but instead he arrives there a prisoner of his own blindness. Now, by the way, Saul was blind in more ways than one, but for the first time in his life, he recognized his own blindness. Isn't it interesting how it often takes a person reaching their lowest point before they finally decide to make the kind of change that we're talking about tonight? Think about that individual that we talked about on Sunday morning that Jesus describes in Luke 15. The prodigal that went into the far country and arrived there in a position of wealth and authority. And it wasn't until his money ran out and he found himself at his lowest point in the pig pen that he decided to change his life. Think about the great apostle Peter. You know, you'll find as you study the gospel accounts that in most cases, his greatest triumphs immediately followed those points when he felt at his lowest, when he was corrected or rebuked by his Lord, when he said something that he didn't think about or acted in a way that wasn't right and had to suffer the consequences of his actions. Saul is like that. He was in a position of power, a position of authority. He was confident in his mission. But Jesus appeared, and it turned his world upside down. So Saul goes into the city of Damascus, and now he has only one thing on his mind. I've got to figure out what the Lord wants me to do. And so he does. He finds a disciple of Christ in that city named Ananias. Now, Ananias had been forewarned to expect Saul. The Lord had told him what was going to happen. And at first, Ananias wasn't so sure about this. After all, the name Saul of Tarsus, again, that was infamous among Christians. And he knew who Saul was, and he knew what Saul did. But he was convinced by the Lord that Saul was to play a very special role in the spread of the gospel from that time forward, particularly among the Gentiles.
So Saul meets with Ananias. And I don't believe that Saul really knew what to expect at this point. I mean, his world has completely changed. It's been turned completely upside down. He's defeated. He's confused. But in recounting his own conversion, he lets us know exactly what took place in this meeting with Ananias. We read in Acts 22, beginning in verse 13, that he says, "Brother Saul, receive thy sight. And the same hour I looked upon him. And he said, The God of our fathers hath chosen thee, that thou shouldest know his will, and see that just one, and shouldest hear the voice of his mouth. For thou shalt be a witness unto all men of what thou hast seen and heard. And now why tarriest thou? Arise, and be baptized, and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord." Now, as Saul learned the way of the Lord more perfectly, the lights didn't just come on in his eyes, they came on in his life. Now Saul understood what he didn't understand before. And so now we begin to see Saul devoted. This brief encounter with Jesus totally transformed the life of Saul. Once he learned what God wanted him to do, Saul was a changed man. He no longer focused upon what he wanted, but instead he focused upon what God wanted from him. And notice what happened immediately following his baptism, as recorded for us in Acts 9, beginning in verse 18. It says he was baptized, and when he had received meat, he was strengthened. And Saul was certain days with the disciples that were at Damascus, and straightway he preached Christ in the synagogues, that he is the Son of God. The persecutor is now the preacher. The one that started on the road to Damascus to arrest Christians is now in fellowship with them and has even become one himself. Now remember, Saul is a Benjamite, the tribe that is noted for its fierce and zealous devotion to a cause. And Saul will now use that same zeal and that same devotion that he had previously used in persecuting the people of God. He'll turn it around and he'll use that to spread the gospel of Christ throughout the world. Now, people are confused. They don't understand what's happened. Notice Acts 9 and verse 21. All that heard him were amazed. They were amazed. And they said, Is not this he that destroyed them, that called on his name in Jerusalem, and came hither for that intent, that he might bring them bound unto the chief priests? If you make this kind of dramatic change in your life, understand this, people are not going to understand it. They're not going to accept it. People, the world in general, does not understand Christianity, and it does not understand the effect that Christianity can have upon an individual's life. Now that reminds me of something that I read in 1 Peter 4, beginning in verse 1. Forasmuch then as Christ hath suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. For he that suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lust of men, but the will of God. For the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lasciviousness, lusts, excess of wine, revellings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries, wherein they think it strange that you run not with them to the same excess of riot, speaking evil of you. If you make this kind of change, people are going to talk about you. They won't understand you. They didn't understand Saul. They couldn't comprehend the kind of change that he had made in his life. Did Saul let that bother him? Did that tempt him to return to his former way of life? Saul increased the more in strength and confounded the Jews that dwelt at Damascus, proving that this is very Christ. And from that moment to his dying breath, he would not cease from proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ. That's Saul. Before he could become the great apostle Paul, he had to leave behind his life of defiance. He had to become defeated on the road to Damascus, and he had to dedicate himself to complete devotion to Christ. Now, in the time that we have remaining, I want to talk to you briefly about 3 startling realizations that Saul discovered and that you and I must discover if we're going to begin our transformation from defiance to devotion. Here's number 1. Realize that Jesus knows our hearts. Even on that remote path through the wilderness, Saul couldn't hide from Jesus. Jesus knew that Saul was on that road to Damascus, and he knew why he was going there. More importantly, he knew what was on Saul's mind and what was in his heart. And he knew what Saul could become given the right instruction and the right motivation. I want you to think about the apostles of our Lord. When you consider the men that Jesus called to follow him while he was upon this earth, one thing you can notice about each of those men is this. Though they weren't what Jesus wanted them to be when he called them, he knew what they could become. And as long as those men would follow Jesus, he would mold them and he would shape them to be the leaders that he knew they could be. Jesus knew what Saul could become. Saul didn't know what he could become. Jesus knew Saul better than Saul knew himself. And you know, the psalmist said in Psalm 44 and verse 21, "Shall not God search this out? For he knoweth the secrets of the heart." And in a passage that would aptly describe Saul himself, Solomon said this in Proverbs 21 and verse 2, "Every way of man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord pondereth the hearts." Everyone wants to believe that they're on the right track. But the truth is that we sometimes can want something in life so badly that we try to rationalize how it fits into God's will. And then we find ourselves struggling with whether our course of action is right in His eyes, and we often suppress our feelings because turning a blind eye to them allows us to continue to live our lives as we want to live them, as we choose to live. And Jesus would describe that mindset in this way: "It is hard for thee to kick against the goads." So we first got to realize that, like Saul, we cannot hide from God. Whatever our plans and whatever our thoughts may be, God knows us. He understands our intentions better than we ever will. 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 25, "Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." He knows our hearts. Number 2, we've got to realize that we must surrender to His will. the most important question that Saul ever asked was this one: Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? We have to wonder how much good would come if Christians today would continually ask that question. It's often so easy to try to fit God's will into our own framework. Again, we want something so badly, it's difficult to see past our own ambition. So we begin to rationalize how God must feel the same way that we do. One thing we've got to come to understand is this: my thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are my ways your ways, saith the Lord. In fact, not only are God's thoughts and God's ways different from our own, they're bigger and better than our own. At times, most of us have found ourselves praying fervently for something that we feel is right for us. It's just got to be right for us. It could be a career. It could be a relationship. It could be some other kind of personal goal. Nothing wrong with that at all. But there should come a time when we stop praying so much about what we want and about what we desire and begin just simply praying this prayer: Thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. In Luke 14 and verse 33, Jesus said, Whosoever he be of you that forsaketh not all that he hath, he cannot be my disciple. And certainly that should include our own personal ambitions and our plans for the future. So if we're going to transform our lives, we've got to surrender to His will. Number 3, we've got to realize that we must follow where we cannot see. After Saul's encounter with Jesus, he was blind. He was led into the city of Damascus, but Saul's loss of sight, that was more than just physical. Before this encounter with Jesus, Saul had his whole life all planned out. He knew what was before him. He had ambition. He had plans. But now it's all changed. He no longer knew what the road had in store for him. So after asking Jesus to tell him what he wanted him to do, Jesus merely replied this way. He said, Arise and go. When we decide to devote our lives to the service of Jesus, He'll tell us the same thing. Now, we all like to think that we have some measure of control over our own lives, and we all want to know what the future has in store for us. And even when we seem open to God's will, we'd like for God to tell us where He wants us to go and what He wants us to do and give us a map that very clearly shows us how we're going to get there and where we're going to end up. God doesn't do that. He doesn't always tell us what the future holds. He doesn't always inform us of the plans that He's got in store for us. He simply says, Follow me. Matthew 4:19. You just start walking, and as long as you're following me, I'll take care of the rest. You know, Paul would come to understand this principle very well. He would later say in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7, we walk by faith and not by sight. We can only do that because we know that we have a faithful and loving God who will never fail us. In John 10, Jesus would describe Himself as a shepherd, and we're His sheep. He implied that our journey through life will often be dark. We won't always know what lies ahead. But here's our comfort. When He putteth forth His own sheep and goeth before them. The sheep follow him, for they know his voice. From this day forward, Saul would live a life that was totally devoted to Jesus. He never forgot what he had done before, but he knew that he had been forgiven. And when the time came for him to depart this physical life, some of his final recorded words are an encouragement to devotion to Jesus. I charge thee, therefore, before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who shall judge the quick and the dead at his appearing in his kingdom, preach the word. Be instant, in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine. He goes on to say, watch thou in all things, endure affliction, do the work of an evangelist, make full proof of thy ministry. Paul says, devote your life to the service of Christ. He did that. And because of his devotion, he was able to say, as his life came to an end, I'm now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I've fought a good fight. I've finished my course. I've kept the faith. Henceforth, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them also that love his appearing. Transformation doesn't always occur without struggle. It also doesn't take place without a newfound sense of joy and peace within, knowing that our Heavenly Father knows us, that he cares for us, and that he'll safely lead us through this journey called life. If we will open ourselves to a life-changing encounter with Jesus, his will become evident. His name will be glorified, and our lives will be turned upside down. Friend, do you need to come to Jesus in obedience tonight? Through faith, repentance, confession, and baptism for the remission of sins, you can become a child of God. And from that time forward, you live a changed life. A life that's not lived for self, but a life that's lived for Christ. Have you made that change before, but it didn't stick? Maybe your commitment has wavered. If it has, you need to return to your Lord. If you have that need tonight, don't wait another day. Come to him now and begin living for him as together we stand and sing.